Good afternoon! My name is Brad Trammell, and for as long as I can remember, we've been at war. No, not that war, or even these ones. I'm referring to the culture war, America's endless digital battle between coastal elites and deplorables, libtards versus chud cells. What started out as a shrewd effort to sway niche voters has now become an inescapable conflict that defines practically every aspect of American life. So instead of trying to own or trigger either side, what I'm interested in answering is a simple question. How did the culture war become endless? This report is about how social media companies perpetuate the culture war to maximize the time we spend on their platforms. I'll be looking at the ideological origins of Silicon Valley and how their twisted beliefs have been implemented on us through algorithms designed to make us hate each other. So join me as we reveal the data mining wizard behind the digital curtain. This is the Culture War Report. Chapter 1, our never-ending culture war. The culture war is both our national pastime and our national crisis. It's a benign way to spend 15 minutes on the toilet arguing with a stranger, just as much as it is an insanity-inducing battle. This is because the culture war encompasses not just discussions about America's most historically charged subjects like class or gender or race, but because it's able to infect even the most seemingly minor aspects of our lives. Whether it's the beans you eat or the entertainment you watch or the car you drive, you get the sense that every single decision in your life has been automatically coded as a sign of support for either the red team or the blue team, whether you like it or not. The reason the culture war isn't a battle over physical territory is because there's no way to escape it. There's nowhere you can run when even your running shoes are still a part of it. Ever since email was invented, there were no longer work hours because work could be done at any time. And as soon as smartphones became ubiquitous, we all came to inhabit the same digital sphere, together forever no matter the distance that separated us. The same holds true for the culture war. Anywhere you go, any time of the day, you're just a scroll down the news feed away from immersing yourself in it once again. What compounds the pressure behind the culture war, what compounds the incredulity people feel towards each other for not sharing their specific cultural beliefs, is that more people now have more access to more information than ever before. And yet it feels like there's less consensus over anything than ever before. The more information we share, the more we're collectively atomized and divided. How could this be the case? It's like we're all stuck on an island together, desperate for water, but the more we drink from the endless supply of salt water surrounding us, the thirstier and more desperate we get. Still, I can't blame people for participating in the online culture war, and not just because I do it myself all the time, but because it can feel like the only agency we have left. It can feel like the only form of political protest available to us where we can actually see our ideas making a difference in someone else's life. This is the real value behind triggering the enemy online. The grief that a spicy meme or ratio comment can cause is funny, but the real sense of satisfaction comes from knowing that someone out there is fucking listening to you, that you aren't just shouting into a void. This feeling of political impotence is especially sharp, given how little effect all the recent in-person protests from the last 6 or 10 or 20 years have had. I think it's worth asking at this point, what is the efficacy of assembling thousands of people at a specific location to temporarily march around holding up signs and chanting slogans when we know power is no longer centralized in any specific location? Is the idea that by creating enough of a spectacle, by amassing enough negative media attention, that the message will have some political impact through the sheer force of guilt tripping alone? Do people still think billionaires and politicians are actually motivated by a sense of shame? How could this be possible when the accumulation of power requires these criminals to be utterly shameless? We know the neoliberal hegemony that controls American politics refuses to enact policies the majority of Americans agree on. We know that public opinion has almost no effect whatsoever on the course of legislative politics. The reason politicians are so consistently eager to bring the conversation back to the culture war is because it's the only opportunity they have in what is effectively a single-party system to differentiate themselves from one another. So the question becomes, is there ever going to be an end to all this? Or are we doomed to endure two sides screaming fake news at each other on Facebook forever? Well, when you look at the vast number of articles warning us about an impending civil war, you get the sense that many have already made their peace with the inevitability of the culture war being a terminal feature of American life, that we have no choice but to reintroduce physical boundaries to corral our cultural differences. The idea of breaking America apart along culture war borders is an odd conclusion for both liberals, who are typically pro-open borders, and conservatives whose entire identity is based on national exceptionalism. Ultimately, I think this wave of secession doomerism is more a reflection of the media class's self-pity for being forced to share a country with people who don't like the same TV shows as them, more than it's a reflection of any kind of viable political project. We're probably all going to be stuck here together for the foreseeable future. But nonetheless, if you're a person who sees history as a struggle between classes over the distribution of resources, rather than a struggle between cultural affinity groups over the distribution of triggered compilations, then the culture war can be exhausting to witness on a daily basis. The obvious winners of our endless battle over nonsense like whether exercise is actually white supremacy or whether you should be allowed to secretly swear at the president aren't the Twitter users who rack up the most likes. The winners of the culture war are the billionaires, the owners of capital, who are more than happy to watch their servant class of wage cucks bicker at each other online. The culture war is diametrically opposed to class consciousness because it rots your brain into thinking the people you share the most in common with are actually your greatest enemy. And not only that, but the culture war tricks its participants into thinking they're on the same side as the people who exploit them, that Elon Musk or secret government agencies are somehow their parasocial besties. Generally, I think the healthiest way to navigate the culture war is to try to understand the other side as having a different coping mechanism to what are ultimately shared material interests. In times of crisis, people can believe some weird shit. I know it can be awkward to admit to yourself that, yes, I share more in common with the average person who believes JFK Jr. is still alive than I share in common with my imaginary best friend, the FBI, or my fellow hustlepreneur, Elon Musk. But it's true. When you view culture as a symptom rather than a cause, it allows you to avoid the zero-sum moralizing so much of the culture war is perpetuated by. But there's another wartime strategy other than know thy enemy that's historically proven to be effective, which is for the two sides to find a common enemy. Aside from the single-party system governing us, there's really no candidate more perfect for being a common enemy of the people than the Silicon Valley tech platforms themselves, the overlords who we sacrifice our privacy to in exchange for the right to hate one another, and the people who benefit the most from ensuring the culture war never ends. For politicians, the culture war is a convenient branding strategy, but for Silicon Valley, the ability to maintain an endless stream of irresolvable comment thread conflicts is their lifeblood. The culture war is the digital material they extract their profits from. The problem is, both libtards and chud cells have a limited understanding of how tech platforms exploit them, in part because they're so preoccupied with owning each other on those platforms. This confusion is intentional. For decades, tech platforms have hidden behind a shroud of neutrality to protect them from the scorn of both their own users and the government officials who've been in a position to regulate them. Silicon Valley is fond of making a guns don't kill people, people kill people kind of argument, which is to say, don't blame us for the societal alienation and conflict our platforms consistently cause. You're the ones who keep posting. We're just neutral bystanders. By presenting their platforms as open and participatory, they're able to disguise the fact that they're actually involved in an insidious effort to replace governments and concentrate power in the hands of an elite few, all at the expense of everyone else's well-being. This is why, if there's a single concept to take away from this report, it's the idea that there is no such thing as a neutral technology. The technology always has values embodied in it that incentivize users to adopt certain behaviors and worldviews. In order to dispel the myth of neutrality and better understand how the values embodied in these platforms make sure the culture war never ends, I think we need to go back to the ideological origins of Silicon Valley itself. These platforms didn't come to us from neutral gods. They came from a specific time, place, and people whose shared beliefs led us to the heckin' clusterfuckerino we live in today. Chapter 2. the Californian ideology. Part of what makes Silicon Valley such a perfect common enemy is that their own set of beliefs, known as the Californian ideology, has its origins in both New Left and New Right thinking. There's something for everyone to hate. The Californian ideology was a love child born from the 1960s, and its mommy and daddy were Ayn Rand and Marshall McLuhan. From mommy, they received their beliefs in things like libertarianism, neoliberal economics, and the mythology that history was forged by the sheer genius of inventive individuals. From daddy, they received a techno-utopian belief that the old order would be overthrown thanks to the intrinsically empowering effects of new technology. Daddy taught them the convergence of media and computing would inevitably result in an electronic direct democracy where everyone would be able to freely express themselves. Ultimately, the Californian ideology is a liberal libertarian belief system, which sees technology as a solution to politics because they see technology as being outside of politics. But the California ideologue's yearning for a world beyond governments has a practical origin story too. Many of the people who would go on to define Silicon Valley by the 1990s were baby boomer ex-hippies who participated in something called the New Communalism movement. Having thrown their bodies on the gears of capitalism for the sake of sexual liberation, racial desegregation, and to bring an end to the war in Vietnam, many hippies eventually found that all the protests and manifestos didn't quite have the sweeping effect they wanted. By the time Richard Nixon was voted president in 1968 at the peak of hippie culture, it became clear the revolution they were hoping for wasn't going to come, leaving many disillusioned and looking for answers elsewhere. So, from the late 1960s through the 1970s, nearly 200,000 disaffected hippies left the cities in search of communal lives in California's woods and deserts, many of them landing in the region we now call Silicon Valley. If America couldn't become the revolutionary state they wanted, then they could at least create their own micro-utopias within America. Many of these new communalists agreed with Charles Reich when he wrote his 1970 bestseller, The Greening of America, that industrial society offered a robot life in which man is deprived of his own being and he instead becomes a mere role, occupation, or function. According to Reich, the solution was to turn inward. It was the idea that you don't have to change society, you just have to free your own mind. The communalists would be together, but each person would be left to fend for themselves, to live their specific truth. They believed this conscious individualism would be the foundation of a new kind of society, one that would be non-hierarchical and collaborative. Ultimately, the new communes ended in disaster, in what would turn out to be an eerily similar preview of the digital culture war the same people would go on to help create. By starting from year zero all over again, the new communalists found themselves recreating the same problems as the industrial societies they wanted to leave behind. With no institutions in place to protect individuals from one another, might became right. Labor was divided along traditional lines, charismatic charlatans came to rule over their cult-like followings, and the social life of the communes was fueled not by free love, but by constant hostility. New communalists routinely subjected each other to brutal, hours-long group interrogations, mercilessly questioning each other's political allegiances and group loyalties. It turned out the horizontal, decentralized lack of structure in the new communes wasn't post-political at all, but was instead a power vacuum that invited people to indulge their worst, most tribally combative instincts. There was one thing that unified the new communes, though, and it came in the form of a magazine that allowed their dysfunctional tribes to be interlinked by information. It was called the Whole Earth Catalog, and it was started in Menlo Park by a former Merry prankster and Ayn Rand fanboy named Stuart Brand. The catalog was a map of all the new communes you can join and a library of the commune's ideological interests. It was also a practical guide that gave readers access to everything from tips for cheap travel to the tools needed for outdoor living. The catalog provided a romanticized vision of collective individualism while conveniently leaving out the brutal struggle sessions that defined new communal life. Fred Turner notes that as the first nodes of the internet were being wired together, the catalog became a paper-bound search engine. Many of the most influential engineers of what would later become Silicon Valley were heavily influenced by the Whole Earth Catalog. Steve Jobs, a former member of one of the new communes himself, called the catalog, quote, "the Bible of my generation, a version of Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along." This connection between hippie individualism and information systems was literalized when, in the mid-1980s, Stuart Brand helped design an online discussion system known as the Whole Earth Electronic Link, or WELL. On the WELL, users dialed into a server where they saw messages from other users in threaded conversations. This early and highly influential social media network was the logical extension of the liberal libertarian world they've been working on for decades. Finally, everyone could be alone together. Instead of questioning why liberal libertarianism led them to hate each other, the misguided lesson these boomers took away from the failure of new communalism was that if people couldn't organize themselves, then trust should be placed in neutral technology to organize a utopian society. As Howard Rheingold, a journalist and early member of the WELL, said, quote, "personal computers were created by young iconoclasts who had seen the LSD revolution fizzle and the political revolution fail. Computers for the people was the latest battle in the same campaign. The political demands of the hippies were dropped in exchange for a pure focus on techno-utopian individualism. You no longer needed to rebel against the system. Now all you needed to do was submit to the natural laws of technological progress and the free market. Technology would be the solution to politics." For the emerging generation of neoliberal politicians who already believed in decreasing the role of government, the Californian ideology was a perfect fit. It was the end of history. By the 1990s, politicians, the media, and business were all promoting some version of the Californian ideology in unison. Everywhere you looked then, much like now, you were propagandized on the idea that information technologies empower the individual, enhance personal freedom, and reduce the need for nation states. That all the institutions we have should be replaced by sans serif apps full of flat illustrations. And the key to creating this utopia was making sure big government left these genius Californian entrepreneurs alone, even when they moved fast and broke things, that the free market was the sole mechanism capable of building the techno-utopia that's set to arrive any day now. Well, any year now, or maybe any decade now. At any rate, techno-utopia is right around the corner. We just have to keep trusting the plan. So, despite its many catastrophic failures, this Californian idea that there are technological solutions to political problems is still the underlying liberal libertarian belief behind everything from the creation of the personal computer to Facebook's algorithm to Bitcoin's white paper. It's the idea that technology's neutrality allows us to govern ourselves, just like the failed new communalists did before. The problem is, the only tool that's truly neutral is a tool that's never been used. To introduce any technology into a society that's already based on massive income inequality can only exacerbate the problems that already exist. But of course, no technology is neutral to start with. It's always created and maintained by flawed humans too. There is no technological solution to political problems because there is no technology that exists outside of our own politics. The difference between government and tech companies isn't that one is biased and the other is neutral. The difference is that the government is ostensibly supposed to serve the public interest. Governments fail to do this when they're run by people who see themselves as representatives of private interests rather than being public servants. But that's not to take away from the government's ideal purpose, which is to help protect people from exploitation at the hands of one another. Government is a safety net of cooperation in a world otherwise defined by the brutality of competition. Government is the recognition that some of the most important things we have, things like natural resources, education, healthcare, infrastructure, policing, these are all things that are best managed according to their ability to help people, not according to their ability to generate money. On the other hand, the private companies that run tech platforms have just a single responsibility to their shareholders, which is to make a profit by any means necessary. The reason tech platforms aren't a solution to government is because they don't share a comparable purpose with the government. Tech platforms do, however, have a purpose. Beyond the buzzy language of empowering the user or providing a space for dialogue, the practical aims of tech platforms are much more specific and nefarious than that. Now that we've covered the ideological background of Silicon Valley, I think it makes sense to look at how the Californian ideology has been implemented on us and the effect it's had on the culture war. Chapter 3. What do the tech platforms want from us? For all the talk about innovation and paradigm-shifting business ideas that come from Silicon Valley, the truth is that almost every major company they've produced does the exact same thing, which is data collection. The primary aim of tech platforms is to get people to constantly use their service so those people's data can be sold back to them as targeted advertising. The platforms want you to be perpetually scrolling, commenting, DMing, resharing, and/or posting however possible. The more data points users fill out, the more raw material these social media companies have to sell to advertisers and research firms. And of course, the best way to predict users' behavior is by making their own predictions come true. This means nudging users in certain directions and modifying their behavior to create the highest probability of success. So for this chapter, I want to look at two things. First, how social media companies manipulate our behavior to get us to maintain constant use. And second, how their algorithms incentivize us to go to battle with one another through the culture war. Engineering addiction. There's a popular belief that the reason we're all so addicted to our phones is because we, as individuals, are just weak when it comes to controlling our impulses, that we lack the self-control to stop checking our news feeds thanks to a genetic coincidence that everyone suddenly started suffering from clinical narcissism all at the same time. This is nonsense. The fact is, for whatever amount of willpower we can individually muster, there are thousands of highly skilled engineers, designers, and psychologists on the other side of our screens who are paid by some of the most powerful companies in the world to make sure we stay on our devices for as long as possible. The battle was over before it even started. I mean, you could quit cold turkey and throw your device in a bathtub, but most people need their phones and the apps that come with them for their job, to travel, to go to school, you name it. It's from this tiny seed of day-to-day utility that social media companies are able to make a tree of addictive habits blossom. And the most effective way Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter hook us is by making sure we receive messages, photos, and likes according to no set schedule, so that we keep checking for them compulsively and are never sure when we'll receive that next dopamine hit. This way of socially conditioning users to constantly check their phones is based on cognitive research from the 1950s by the psychologist B.F. Skinner. In his paper on operant conditioning, Skinner wrote about something called a variable schedule of rewards, also known as intermittent reinforcement. Skinner noticed that lab mice responded most intensely to random rewards. That mice would press a lever and sometimes they get a small treat, other times they get a large treat, and other times nothing at all. Unlike the mice that reliably received the same treat every time, the mice that received variable rewards seemed to press the lever compulsively. Humans, like the mice in Skinner's box, crave predictability and look for patterns in everything we do. Variability is the brain's cognitive enemy. We have to find the pattern, even when there is none. So our minds make figuring out cause and effect a priority over other functions like self-control or moderation. This is because our brains are wired to search endlessly for the next reward, never satisfied. In an attempt to alleviate this stress, we find ourselves barreling from one pull on the slot machine to the next every time we check our phones, always hunting for a pattern of social reinforcement in what eventually becomes an endless distraction loop. Social media interfaces try to encourage this frenzied search by lumping multiple services together. A push notification for a DM turns into a quick peek at a friend's story, which turns into a quick look at a tagged stranger, which turns into a quick search for that stranger's streetwear company, which turns into a quick peek at a celebrity on the Explore page, which turns into a quick peek at the celebrity's new partner, until you get another DM from the same friend, reminding you why you even opened the app in the first place. The purpose of social media's design is to get us to aimlessly bounce between acting on unconscious impulses to fulfilling social obligations, back and forth so many times that we lose track of any specific purpose. And the main way distraction loops start is through the news feed itself. Engineers called the news feed the bottomless bowl, which is a reference to a study that found people eat 73% more soup out of self-refilling bowls than out of regular ones without even realizing they've consumed extra food. The newsfeed is also a perfect example of a variable reward structure because while we never know when we'll find a post that captivates us, we do know that the opportunity to continue scrolling is infinite. Surely there's a pattern in here somewhere. The stress we feel from searching and not knowing when our next reward will come has a compounding effect. Stress is proven to reduce our ability to pay attention. So the more we search the news feed, the more we lose sight of what it is we're searching for, until eventually the act of mindlessly scrolling becomes the purpose unto itself. By positioning our user experience to be both the cause of our stress and to be the way we relieve our stress, these companies are able to set up an endless loop of nonstop use for data surveillance. Perpetuating conflict. The long-term effects of subjecting 3 billion people to an endlessly stressful search for validation aren't a mystery to the platforms. They know exactly what the results are of doing this to their users. There's a reason so many people in Silicon Valley don't let their own children use the products they create. Facebook's own internal documents from 2019 are quoted as saying, quote, "We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Teens blame Instagram for increases in anxiety and depression," end quote, which was a reaction that was consistent across all age groups. Among people who reported suicidal thoughts, up to 13% of users traced the desire to kill themselves to Instagram. A big part of why so many people want to kill themselves after looking at Instagram goes back to the algorithmically generated content they're presented on their bottomless bowl news feeds. When Instagram stopped presenting posts chronologically in 2016, it meant the algorithm was designed to display posts the company believed would maintain users' interest for the longest time possible. As a result of this switch, things like landscapes and brunch photos were deprioritized, and posts featuring people's faces and bodies were algorithmically promoted. As users came to recognize the additional visibility these types of posts generated, Instagram effectively incentivized their users to create even more selfies, which meant people showing even more skin. The irony of this situation is that many radlibs from the 2010s thought of posting lewds as the highest form of individualized expression. These selfie activists went so far as to call out the platforms through the popular #FreeTheNipple campaign, scolding social media for censoring their ability to bear it all online. The reality of the situation was that social media companies like Instagram were actively encouraging users to bare their bodies as much as possible within their terms of service. The result of these accidentally overlapping agendas wasn't the death of the male gaze, but was instead the expansion of explore page Instagram models and a competitive atmosphere of vacation swimwear selfies. The exact things young women now describe as what depresses them about using the app. But the biggest change in the way our bottomless bowls of slop were served up to us happened in 2018, when Instagram tweaked the algorithm to promote what it misleadingly called meaningful social interaction. After a year of declining engagement on Facebook, the change was designed to encourage more active use. This meant users would see less professionally produced video content and see more of what their friends and family were sharing. In other words, focus moved away from content that could be passively viewed and towards content that could be actively shared and that would provoke dialogue. To escalate conflict between users, MSI created an internal point system to measure a post's success. A like was worth 1 point, a reaction was worth 5 points, and a significant comment, message, or reshare was worth 30 points. In hindsight, we can see how this new set of MSI incentives led to a now familiar type of content, a type of content that follows a 3-part recipe. Step 1, provoke outrage by identifying a problem in the world. Step 2, create a sense of moral superiority by identifying who's responsible for the problem. And step 3, frame sharing the content as a matter of personal responsibility to help end the problem. The way MSI incentivizes outrage is really the core component. It's the engine of the digital culture war because it focuses us on all the issues that divide people the most. Nuance becomes the enemy when you're trying to construct an in-group to share content as quickly as possible. The problem is, when you continually direct outrage in the same ways against the same subjects, it eventually has diminishing returns. The outrage well can run dry. This is what fuels the perpetual search for new subjects to be incorporated into the culture war by applying familiar forms of outrage to an increasingly wide array of new topics. The more novel the application is, the more reinvigorated the outrage becomes. For example, did you know that protein powder has its roots in racist Nazi eugenics programs? Actually, this isn't true at all, but it sure sounds interesting, and it's precisely the type of content that allows people to extend their pre-existing cultural affinities into new and unexpected territory to allow the infinite expansion of the culture wars to reign. Under this imaginary light, protein ceases to be a supplement and becomes a powerful symbol to be boycotted through anti-fascism. Or, if you're red-pilled, protein becomes an exciting new way to trigger the libs by sharing a photo of you gobbling down a protein shake. The symmetrical beauty of the culture war is that every time one side loses the ability to support something, the other side gains its newest favorite thing that they've coincidentally always loved all along anyway. If the liberal libertarian values embodied in MSI's technology are meant to encourage outrage, then the purest products those values have created are woke infographics and QAnon, both of which came into prominence at the exact moment MSI was introduced. Like I said before, what's so ingenious about infographics is the way they offer moral salvation, not just to those who read them, but specifically to those who share the good word. By instilling a personal responsibility to spread the content, the infographic is an inherently viral format meant to be shared by friends in exactly the way MSI encourages. But if we follow the logic of the infographic just a step beyond the idea that you're a good person for sharing the post, then it naturally follows that everyone who doesn't share that post is a bad person. The popular slogan from a couple summers ago that digital silence equals violence, that people should be compelled to participate in social media by consistently offering their own personalized, long-form condolences to the activist cause of the moment, well, this is basically a wet dream from the data gathering perspective of the platforms. The now pervasive idea that the only way to prove you're not a Nazi is by constantly sharing more information online was truly one of liberals' greatest gifts to Silicon Valley. It's another example of the overlap between the Californian ideology and Radlib's shared belief in conscious individualism. And as with all things in the culture war, this moral imperative to never stop posting was mirrored in conservative culture too. QAnon's digital soldiers were so motivated to share more information about trusting the plan, they would literally organize their sleep schedules with each other to make sure there was always someone in their social group researching and sharing more information about Q to social media 24 hours a day. By adopting the incentives of the algorithm as our own, what MSI has done is invert the relationship between humans and the technological tools we're meant to use. We have now become a tool used by the algorithm to perpetuate itself. It's not just that the algorithm is nudging us towards sharing more articles or posting more hot takes. We now enforce that logic on one another. The idea that digital silence equals violence is a perfect illustration of this dynamic because it equates the life you share through the algorithm as being equivalent to your material existence. You are what you post, so you can never stop posting. To the extent that people have renounced their ability to ever stop posting through slogans like this, the culture war is playing itself out just like an algorithm would, adding one digit and subtracting one digit infinitely, pushing back and forth in equal measure forever. Disentangling ourselves from the algorithm means ridding ourselves of the belief that the culture war will ever have a winner. The purpose of the culture war, from the perspective of those who benefit from it, is to maintain its existence forever, not to crown a victor and turn their enlightened views into the law of the land. But beyond the algorithm and its Silicon Valley overlords, the one thing that keeps the culture war going is a misguided sense of hope that we can alter one another through owning one another, that all of our comment section beefs will cumulatively add up to become the change we want to see in the world, rather than just being a way we offer catharsis to ourselves. This hope we have that despite all odds, things can somehow still get better, this is a good thing, and it's our responsibility to make sure hope doesn't just become a delusion. Sometimes I think about those new communalists sitting there in the desert, hot and stinky, angry at the people around them after yet another struggle session shouting match. And because all the new communes failed, it means there was a point in each and every one of their lives when they realized it wasn't working anymore. Each one of them had a final day where they walked away from a life of conflict with one another, where they left the commune and abandoned the liberal libertarian ideals that brought them there. I recognize that leaving our culture war behind presents different challenges than leaving a desert, given the way our digital existence follows us beyond physical borders. But I still hold out hope that at some point, enough people will recognize who their true enemy in the culture war is, and that we'll have a final day too.